So now we're moving to the second leg of our webinar presentations. And now it's going to be Prof Manthalu, who is going to be giving us the talk. He's from University of Malawi. And what he's going to be talking to us about is national development, neoliberalism, and decolonization, which have been things that we've been discussing in the past months in the center. And this looking at no easy road for the future of Malawian higher education. Just a brief background on Prof Manthalu. He's an associate professor in the newly established Department of Higher Education and Professional Development School of Education at UNIMA. He is the inaugural head of department, and his research areas include higher education in Africa, education for democratic and global citizenship, global justice and education, educational decolonization, and African philosophy and education. And I think these are areas most of us here are interested in. He is the co-author of a book titled Cosmopolitan Education and Inclusion, Human Engagement and the South. That was published by Palgrave, and he has co-edited 2 other books. So we're really happy to have you here. The format is going to be the same as earlier. So it's going to be 35 to 40 minutes of presentation, and then 20 minutes for engagement. I'll ask those online to please mute your mics as the presenter is talking. I think that's all for now. I'll leave it to you to start the discussion.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I am making this presentation, which I've titled National Development, Neoliberalism, and Decolonization, Easy Road for the Future of Malawian Higher Education. The starting point for this presentation is the idea that higher education has got a role to play, particularly in a country like Malawi, and in this case, I'm particularly focused on public higher education. Public higher education institutions have got to contribute towards national development. But as I'm going to present here, that role, performance, achievement of that role is not always easy. I think there are quite some major demands, some not so straightforward terrain, which the higher education must navigate to achieve that particular goal. So this is the structure. I'll firstly talk about the role of the university, the public role of the university particularly. Then I'll talk of the context of Malawian higher education, and then we're going to see how ready the university in Malawi, higher education institutions in Malawi, higher education in general as it were in Malawi, how able is it to achieve some of the obligations that it has. So when we are talking about the public role of the university, one of the things that comes out, I know there are contentious different schools of thought regarding what should be the mandate of the role of higher education. Some scholars argue that unlike secondary education or primary education, we cannot prescribe the aims or purposes of higher education. But after all the arguments are made, admittedly, one of the major roles of any higher education, particularly a public higher education, is that it must serve the public good. And I think sometimes that doesn't say much because it begs the question: what is the public good? But the public good, understood in terms of production of knowledge, shaping public policy, and then developing skills for critical engagement and responsibility. And also the other role is we talk of when we are talking of the public good, higher education institutions must help towards ending human suffering or ameliorating human suffering in different forms. And that's why I think when we look at promotion of when we talk of ameliorating human suffering on the one hand, and as well as promoting human flourishing, that now encompasses most other kind of programs. Because for the first component, when we talk of social justice, usually we're inclined to think that it's only the social sciences, the humanities programs that are for that mandate. But when you consider that the university as a higher education institution has got a role to ameliorate human suffering and promote human flourishing, then obviously we are saying that it's going to contribute to human development, and that brings in all the other non-social science, non-humanities programs, because all research which an institution of higher learning is engaged in, by the end of the day, you want to kind of ameliorate the suffering which people experience in one way or the other. It could be medical, it could be engineering, and so on, as well as you just want them to flourish. So ultimately, we can conclude that one of the aims of higher education is that it must contribute for human development. It is not the only goal, of course, but that's one of its key obligations. Now, we do have universal minimum conditions for the realization of that good. But when we are talking of the public good, what is the public good? It is not something that is absolute. I think this is very important as we proceed, because what is a public good for society A may not necessarily be the exact public good for another society. Why? Because in a sense, for a particular society, a particular community to agree on what constitutes a public good for them, it's going to be a result of some public deliberation, a democratic process in a way where people will agree. And even if they agree, it's always something which is contentious. But at least we know that when we say this is what is good for this society, it's something which the people in that society must reflect on based on their lived experiences, based on their history, and based on other factors. They should be able to say that this is what we think is good for our society. Obviously, there are some underlying minimum conditions. I mean, for example, you have to respect the rights of every other person in that society and so on. But the key thing is what constitutes a public good is not absolute, and it results from the people in that particular community or society engaging in some deliberation to say that this is what we think is good for us, which entails that what is a public good is contextual. Now, I think this is important because we are always tying higher education to achieving the public good. What it means is that how higher education serves or pursues the public good is reasonably expected to be different across societies. How in society A, higher education is going to prioritize as something that is pertinent for the members of that community to say that this is what we think in our priorities. If we are to have this, I think it's going to promote human well-being in our society and so on. It's going to vary because it's a result of, in an ideal world, it's a result of a deliberative process. People have to agree. And that deliberative process is influenced by quite a couple of subjective principles. So its substance and form, as I'm saying, it varies across society, implying that if a university is going to pursue the public good, then it must be connected and be responsive to that context. And that context nowadays has two faces. It's a local context on the one hand, and it's also a global context in the other hand, such that when you talk of human existence today, human beings are existing on two dimensions. At one dimension, they are global people, and on another dimension, you are a local person. So when we are talking of higher education that is going to serve the public good, it shouldn't be one which is restricted only to the local context. Neither should it be only about the global context, but it should be able to strike a balance between the two. Now, having explored that public role of higher education, and as again I must emphasize, it's more pertinent for a public higher education institution because it is running on citizens' tax money, and everybody has got a legitimate expectation that one way or the other, the university or the higher education institutions, directly or indirectly, they must change their condition. So going to the Malawian context, as we are pursuing that development, that national development as a country, it should progress. The guiding document presently in Malawi, like Malawi's development blueprint, is what Malawi 2063, and it's actually titled Malawi 2063, an inclusively wealthy and self-reliant nation. The idea is that by 2063, the country should become an industrialized upper middle income country. So there is an expectation that quite a number of things should change. The economic condition of the country should change. Presently, we are largely a net importing nation, and I think we face some adverse effects because the bottom line is the economy needs to be refunctionalized. So industrialization is at the heart of this ambition, and that industrialization requires the inclusive human capital. So I think one of the key things of this vision is that they should be inclusive. The nation as it is developing, there must be that inclusion. Like all people should be progressing together as a country. So higher education comes in, and according to this vision, it's very emphatic on enhancing the STEM subjects, particularly science, technology, engineering, and arts and mathematics. But reading through the document, you can see that they just slip through the arts, so that maybe there should be kind of a balance. But its focus and what it seeks to achieve and enhance in higher education is to make sure that there is scientific, technological, and engineering innovation that are going to spur economic development and job creation. So that's ambition, that's a goal. And the higher education comes in handy, and I think it has got a legitimate role to play to help achieve this, given what we have already looked at as the public role of higher education. So the interesting thing in Malawi is that while higher education institutions are one of the major catalysts for realizing this vision, there is something which is interesting because, as I've already said, the vision is more emphatic on science subjects. And when you look at the developments, the way they have been happening, there has been what you would call a de-emphasis on the non-science subjects, I think, which triggers a discussion which we were just having before we started this time around, that what does it mean to be developed? Does it mean that you should promote one particular discipline at the expense of the other? Questions of, can you quantify the value, or can you always quantify the value of one subject or one discipline over another area? But the most interesting thing is that the prioritization of the STEM programs in Malawi in higher education institutions has resulted in increases in intake of science-related programs, but then it's creating a challenge. The challenge is that the context of Malawi with access creates a fundamental problem, as we're going to see. So just a short context of the Malawian higher education. There are 6 public universities, and every year when people sit for their final secondary school examinations, only for those people who are eligible to go into university, only 25% gets admitted to university because of I think, space constraints. And then the secondary schools in Malawi are categorized, I would generally put them in three categories. There are those secondary schools which are regarded as prestigious, government funded, but they're very few. I think it continues with the legacy of the British colonial rule. So these schools, they select the best performing students across the country. And then you have these other conventional schools, which are boarding secondary schools in most cases, or day secondary schools. They are properly resourced in terms of human resource as well as the infrastructure. But then we have what are called community day secondary schools. We just call them CTSSs. Mostly they're in the rural areas, and usually their characteristics that they have is they're not properly resourced, both in terms of human resource as well as in terms of infrastructure. So 50% of all public secondary schools in Malawi are these CTSSs. Usually there are schools which you will not find a laboratory. In most cases, maybe less than 20% of the teaching staff are qualified. In most cases, they just get people who are teaching from primary school to support that school because it's in a community to support them. So in 2023 university admissions, these schools, though they constitute 50%, these schools only contributed 16% of students into university. And in relation to the STEM programs, they only contributed 20% of. So what is very clear here is that if we are prioritizing STEM subjects to spur economic growth, and then the selection, where the majority of the students are coming from, they cannot participate. They do not have a means of accessing this pro-STEM kind of higher education. It means the question of inclusion already is going to suffer. So the higher education institution, which was supposed to enable the inclusion, the way the framework is set for exclusion in the first place, and it's a majority of them that are going to be who are not going to be admitted into university. Now that's a question. We're saying we want to achieve development which is inclusive. The inclusion already suffers. And then this issue of privatization of the STEM programs, I think, as I've already hinted, it creates a challenge because we have already talked about universities. What it means to develop is much more than having science and such disciplines. We also need development in other areas. But another area where now we are talking of this neoliberal influence on the education, we are talking of there is a tokenistic commitment of the state to supporting higher education. I think one of the things we have been having the discussions are like, what kind of support does the state provide to public higher institutions? What has been happening presently, unlike what was happening in the past, is because of following these structural adjustments recommended initially by the World Bank, and then in the past 20 or 15 years, again, further structural adjustment policies have been made. The state's contribution to higher education is largely, you can reduce it to supporting only operations of the university, paying for staff and so on. Not much of funding research. Things which probably a couple of years before were happening. What's the reason the government says the universities must get this from the private sector? But then the challenge is you don't have such a heavy industry which does support university research. So you are seeing that government is distancing itself from its obligation under this modern approach of managing university, that the state should have as little commitment to supporting the higher education, let the university find innovative ways and get resources. The problem the result is that you cannot have authentic research because you can't find the kind of research which universities in Malawi largely do is research that is commissioned by other institutions. You only participate, and with that kind of research, you cannot achieve your public role towards the public good because you always have to squeeze in your interest in the agenda of some other university. But again, this question of prioritization of STEM, is it only STEM that we need, or we need both? There is no problem in increasing the number of STEM programs and students, but it should not be at the expense of the other programs. So what I'm saying is that for STEM, for people to make maximum benefit from STEM programs, there must be a certain context. And that context is not always created by the STEM programs themselves or STEM disciplines. You need the non-STEM programs to make sure you create an environment where the benefits of the STEM programs are going to be appreciated. So, for example, if you talk of internet access, when you have a country, say, where you have about 36% of the population is not literate, and then you have the internet. It's something which can benefit every person. The internet shouldn't be a privilege of only the educated people. You should be able to have someone. My grandmother in the village there, she's illiterate, but she's at least literate in Chichewa, our local language. She should be able to benefit from the internet. Read what experts are translating in accessible language. How should you engage in a resilient agriculture in the era of climate change? Another thing is that how can people even question the misinformation that goes on the internet that spreads around if their own language is not present on the internet? And what does it take for the language to be present? You need to invest in your in local languages, so that there should be languages that can explain concepts and things that have emerged in these days. So this issue of developing the language so that the language serves the everyday person, regardless of how educated they are. And again, another very typical example in the context of Malawi is the question of the law. In Malawi, every law, almost every law, whether it's about traffic, it's about the environment, about everything, is in English. But here's a country where 36% of the people are not literate in vernacular languages. Even for those that are literate in vernacular languages, very few of them will understand English. Now you have laws of the country established, and one of the fundamental principles of law across the world is that the ignorance of the law is not an excuse. Now you have we teach people about the law, and we talk of access to justice and fairness. We look at other things, but ignoring the things that matter. Because how are you going to convict someone over a crime which they don't know is a crime in the first place? Like recently in our country, they are going to change the Environmental Act, and they're saying that if you are caught like you are cutting down trees, deforestation, burning charcoal, you are going to be fined 5 million kwacha, which is an equivalent to 50,000 rands. And the people who are involved in this trade, most of them are people out there who don't have an education or who are just barely literate. Now, these people have never had access to this law. The law is there in English, but they go to the court of law, they get convicted, nevertheless. And when you look at these problems, you find that it may be justified under another, whether for logistical purposes or whatever purposes, but you can't have a normative justification for convicting a person over crimes which are not accessible in their languages. So that's why I say that we really need that this more than the STEM, we need the other disciplines. So the other areas which we've talked about, we have raised in that topic, is the questions of decolonization. I think we have already started making hints of this. That there is a legacy of coloniality in Malawi. And I think the major thing is that this idea of despising and trivializing the centering of African experiences in higher education. There's always one excuse or the other that, no, I think education is something which is impartial, but there isn't education in the strictest sense that is impartial. Education is informed by a particular philosophy. Education is informed by a particular perspective about the world. And one thing I must emphasize, when we are talking of decolonization, we're not talking of substitutionalism or returning to something or pushing away something, because in all fairness, there is no society, no culture that developed by its own tools and its own ways. Every culture borrows one thing from the other. I remember when I was at my undergrad, I studied a bit of language. We were reading then that when you look at English as a language, the lexicon of English, then they were saying about 40 or 50% of English lexicon is borrowed from other languages. So it just shows that there is no society that can say we are self-contained. So decolonization should not be understood as saying we are doing away with this and we want to start building stuff from scratch, because such a thing never happens. But it's a question of saying, while you are bringing this and that, where is that centrally concerns you in your education processes? So Malawian higher education is also plagued by the question of knowledge generation. What shapes the things that we, when we are developing our curriculums? I will give my own example, like the courses which I teach, philosophy of education, the history of education thought. You will find that the philosophies of education we have in our program, which is something we have to work on, you will not find the African philosophies there. But the people you are teaching, their orientation, it's not essentialist, but at least in a way, they are influenced by these philosophies. So you will find that sometimes what you are, or the kind of philosophy, the assumptions behind the philosophies or the teaching methods you are teaching are not in sync with the experiences of these students. And there have been studies, I think there's been this study by Pamela, which showed that she scrutinized for a period between 1977 to 2009, global citizenship education. And after serving a major academic database, found out that 86% of contributions of research on that area are from 12% of the global population, like in the developed countries. There is only 12% of the works for that period were from what we generally call the global South. Now, when you look at a scenario like that, you still have this content, you still have to teach your students about global citizenship education. But when you look at global citizenship, what does it mean to be a global citizen? It is not something that is absolute. It is something which must blend both what the experiences of people in one society with what obtains globally. But if you don't participate in the generation of this knowledge, then it means you will just be taking something and then advancing it on other people. And the question of teaching and learning methods inspired by by Malawian perspectives, metaphysical outlooks, and so on. Because teaching and learning methods have got assumptions about the students. They have got assumptions about the society. They cannot just be universal. So it's not always taking a teaching method that works somewhere and then you bring it here and say, people learn this. I've already given an example of the philosophy of education, because these are the things that should shape the kind of methods that we teach. In my university, in Malawi, actually, I would say, you wouldn't say that this particular teaching strategy was developed by a Malawian or an African, as it were. But you look at the challenges in education which we face. We face challenges of overcrowded classrooms. These are not challenges which the people who are developing those theories have in mind when they are developing the theories. A typical example is I met someone, a retired person who has been a primary school teacher for a long time, just retired some 3 or 4 years ago, about the teaching of Chichewa, our local language. Now, she was lamenting that when she was retiring, and it's something which is it's an ongoing discussion presently, there was a change in the methods of teaching Chichewa as a vernacular language. I think those people who have a background of language, they talk of learning as a whole word and learning as a syllable. So if you have to teach someone like English, talk, they just have to learn the whole word at once. Under, they just have to see a picture, someone is under the table, say, okay, this is under, because that's how the language is structured. But for Chichewa and for most Bantu languages, this is what this person was saying, and it's something which I think applies to most Bantu languages. How you sound a word and how you write it are the same. So when you say me, for example, in Chichewa is ine. When you say ine, if you have to write ine, just write e and ne. That's it. So traditionally, all along, people were teaching each other using this syllabic reading method. So you can write any word because you just sound. You say, okay, the first syllable is this and that. Now there was a change. Unfortunately, this approach, the whole word teaching of languages in our context is creating problems, as this retired teacher was lamenting. Actually, she was saying that when the supervisors from the Ministry of Education came and the parliament said, no, but some of these things we were just told that we should do them. Because initially they were blaming the teachers that you are always resistant to change. They implemented the thing, was not working as intended. They said, no, we should have heard from you. But when these things were coming, there were donors, they already put money into it. So that's how it works. So the point is that there are certain methods that should make sense only to a certain context, because it's just transplanting a methodology for teaching English and bringing it through. Yet the two languages are significantly different. So when we are talking of changing, informing teaching and learning methods, that's why it's important that the university should be in the forefront, trying to find ways of how can we, what kind of teaching methods can we have that speak to our context. And usually when we are talking of questions of decolonization like this, critics usually say, but we cannot isolate, the way knowledge is, let's just go with it. It's impartial. There isn't anything we can change. It's not causing any harm to society. They say, the world is global. It's a hybrid. That's true. And actually, a decolonization that promotes isolationism or essentialism is not actually, from my perspective, it's not actually pragmatic or normatively justified. But then this question of saying, let's say, hybridize, it's good and it's always important. And actually, we have to hybridize. That's why we should not take away certain things and say we're going to bring African equivalents of them. That should not be the way. Hybridity is important, but then there is a problem. When you are doing the hybridity, at the hybridity table, everybody else brings something. And then Malawi, and pretty much of Africa doesn't bring anything. And you hybridize everything that is there. And then Africa and Malawi, you are supposed to consume almost everything that is there without putting much on the table. That's a significant problem. It's a significant problem because normatively, it implies, it is a statement from your agency that how come you can't bring something here to hybridize everything? So when we talk of this hybridity, where Africa doesn't contribute as much, it's cross-cutting. You look at sports, you look at technology, you look at education, you look at almost everything, how we run the world, the UN and everything. That's how things are. But that's not a situation which should just be said it's a hybrid. It's a hybridity that is making an unfavorable statement on our collective agency as a country or as a continent. So how do we go forward? As I said, to decolonize is not to replace. Rather, it's about reconceptualization. It's about refocusing. The same things, whether people are going to be learning, whether in the same English, whether they'll be learning in whatever, but can there be a centering of African experiences as the learning is going on? And again, we are mindful that decolonization involves global structures. And usually we blame, there is that kind of victimhood. We blame, oh, we can't because of this. There are so many things we point fingers at. Maybe we cannot do because of that. Yes, it's true that the global structures, global economic structure, the global political structures, and so on, do not favor African experiences. But however, we should know that there are areas which we can, if we are determined, African higher education institutions, if they are determined, there are areas where they can do something and bring up some small change, which in the long run is going to motivate them for further change. So that's why I'm also saying that inescapably, the question of decolonization is a political matter. Because in a country like Malawi, if you have to talk of research and everything, you cannot do it with no one to invest into that. It's a state. The state has to be obliged. Yes, there are these structure adjustment policies recommended by World Bank and everybody else, but then you look at your situation and say, if we don't invest in these things by ourselves, no matter how small it is, it's not going to help us. So there should be that engagement with political leadership. And more importantly, decolonization should depart from a victimhood mentality and then focus on what can be done. Because if we resign to victimhood, it means we are sealing our fate forever. And more importantly, decolonization should use Ubuntu to achieve Ubuntu. In Africa, one of the things which we require is to achieve regional cooperation, because no country on its own can manage to achieve what they should achieve, given the way the global structure is today. The example here would be about, there was Ebola in Africa, I think it's a couple of years ago before COVID. Ebola hit, starting with DRC and then some country in West Africa, was Sierra Leone, I forgot it. The rest of Africa was almost waiting for a solution to come from somewhere. Where are research centers in Africa? Yes, one country cannot manage these clinical trials, are expensive, but why can't a region like SADC or Africa as a whole pull resources together through their respective higher education institutions, say we are going to do research on malaria? Because if you ask me in Malawi, all research about malaria, none of it is funded by the Malawi government. But malaria is a tropical disease, so they're in Europe. So these are the challenges which we have, that Africa, there should be that cooperation, because conducting transformative research is very expensive, and most countries cannot afford it on their own. But should they come together, because their problems are shared, their fates are shared, that's when the African higher education can make an impact. Thank you very much.
Zikomo. Thank you for that presentation. I think we've got 22 minutes for engagement. I'll open the floor for questions. And also, if anyone online would like to ask a question, please do feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, and ask the question. So while we're waiting for people, I will start. While people are still trying to put together their thoughts. Can you perhaps, or have you in your literature review and your studying of decolonization, because I see you're doing that a lot, have you come across with examples of regional corporations within the higher education sector that are successfully working together in pursuing the public good? Maybe it could be Eastern Africa or Western Africa or Northern Africa. Because I'm asking because what you said is true, and I've seen it in Eastern Africa. A lot of this cooperation between institutions across countries. So I wondered if you had an example.
Yeah, I think I would say that we do. I mean, such cooperations. Okay, let me say cooperation as cooperation between universities in different countries. They exist. I think recently I had heard about East Africa, but I think it was at the politicians' level. I think it was in the public domain. They were thinking of something along these lines, that they should have research centers within their region to address common challenges. But the other forms of cooperation, yes, we read about them. But then those that are impactful and transformative, I think we are still quite distant from having them, largely because at the end of all this process are two things. You need the financial resources, number one. And number two, even in these universities coming together thing, it must also be followed by political will, like if it's within a region. And to achieve that, I think it's a process which requires engagement. I mean, all of us know, for example, that our regional political bodies, how they fail to prioritize things that matter in our country. For example, one member country is facing, for example, some political crisis, and all the members, citizens think you should probably do something in this country, and then you find that nothing happens. So to have political leadership in an African country and within an African region come together and then support this, I think it's something that is possible, but it may not always be easy. But I think it's an indispensable part of the future. I don't think there can be such a future without this thing.
Before I give someone just to follow up, don't you think, or do you think we as higher education institutions should be really focusing more on trying to get buy-in from the politicians, because ultimately they're the ones, like you're saying, in other countries, they actually overrule all the decisions, even within the higher education sector. That should be our focus, dealing with the politicians.
Yes, I think that's why I think in this point of moving forward, I was saying that when you look at how to get to where we should be getting, it's not just an academic endeavor. It should also be political. Like there should be that engagement to have these politicians buy-in. It's not always easy, of course, to have a politician buy-in to do something, but with persistence and time, I think it's something which is realizable. But what I emphatically think is that it's difficult without their buy-in. It's difficult.
Thank you. Thank you. There is a comment from Victor. It's quite long. If you don't have a question, I'll ask Victor to please unmute yourself and then maybe ask the question.
Thank you, Faith, and thank you to the presenter. It's quite interesting presentation. So I'm really fascinated with the point on STEM that Malawi has adopted, and like Faith just mentioned, across the region there is also a push for these STEM policies. So, but related to it is that I get the sense that Malawi seems to be getting a lot of policy advice from international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So I'm wondering to what extent is the STEM policy in Malawi, among other policies, is it how much is it a homegrown policy, and to what extent, if any, do these policies meet or reconcile with Malawi's interests and needs? I would appreciate your comment on that.
Thanks, Victor.
All right, thank you very much, Victor. How much is it local? How much is it externally influenced? Well, in my, I would say it's an interesting overlap in a way. Because on the other hand, what we should be clear about is that it's not bad. STEM programs are not bad. Actually, for a country like Malawi, given its current status, there is no way you can achieve the desired economic growth or transformation without heavily investing in the STEM. So that's something which as a country we are obliged to do. But then I was saying it's an overlap because at the same time, most of such recommendations, they also come after World Bank make their assessment about the education system, about this and about that, and they say they're going to give you a grant, but this grant, make sure you spend it on the following things. So presently, most of the projects that are mushrooming in our higher education institutions in Malawi about STEM, they are World Bank funded projects. So you would say that probably on the state it's the will, but then the one who enables it, funding it, is largely such global financial institutions. That's how I would respond.
And I guess just to follow on within that, does the higher education system in Malawi have room for making suggestions or pushing back? Because I imagine when they come from low bank, they already have a set idea how the STEM project is supposed to roll out.
Yeah, I think there's always room. I mean, it should also not appear like the government is not completely doing anything about the local situation. It's trying in its own way. I know of certain projects, even at our own university, had a big project fully funded by the government. But most of such projects, I mean, that fund is like this term. The funds do not necessarily come from here. So the ones who are going to provide the funds are the ones who are going to say do this. Room for engagement, I think there's always room for engaging the state as the higher education institutions. But that's another area where I think in our country we need to do, we should improve, where higher education institutions, their research, the knowledge they create should inform policy. But sometimes you wonder that maybe it's just we're being too idealistic, because you may have all the facts about how certain things should be done, but then if someone has more influence, like in this case an external global financial institution may make certain major recommendations, maybe there may be little room for the state to say let's do it this way. But it's an engagement which with time I think things may slowly start changing. You don't just have to give up on it.
Perfect. Oh, but mushrooming questions. That's great. Okay, shall I start with Daisy? You'll take one question at a time. That's fine. I start with Daisy, then after Daisy, Mika, then after Mika, Chris.
Or maybe I'll go last.
No,
Okay, I'll respect you.
enough time. There's enough time.
Thank you so much, Prof. So my question is, within Malawi's higher education system, are there existing mechanisms for the translation of scientific knowledge, let's say maybe in response to environmental issues or climate change, but then translating this scientific knowledge for the broader population? And if they're not there, do you have any recommendations in regards to that?
Thank you very much for that question. I think perhaps what I meant when I'm talking of there should be these systems through which the typical Malawian general public should have access to these things, like products of science, scientific inquiries. Is not really that it should be the technical concepts, the jargons, they should be couched in vernacular language. Rather, after the way we communicate science, even to communities that are literate, whether it's in English or whatever, presenting it to them in a language that is friendly, that is accessible to them, that you don't have to be an expert in the field to understand what they are talking about. Now, the challenge which I was talking about, the language, the systems with respect to language, is because since we have not been investing in the development of our local languages, because for a language to cope with the demands, not necessarily used for teaching chemistry in university, no, but when people have done their research in chemistry, they want, remember it's for the public good, they want to society to improve in one way or the other, how they are going to communicate that science to the people. After time, there are new concepts coming in. So if your language is underdeveloped, as is the case with the Malawian languages, and processes of developing a language, they require that you have to be deliberate about it. You have to keep pace with changes. And it's not only in Malawi, because if I go on the internet to say anything in any language, just Google, you'll find that very little content is in our local languages which we can read and benefit something from. So the systems which should be there for me is about, can we enhance the development of these languages? Now, this is where this question of saying, let's prioritize only the sciences is a problem. Because if you have your local languages, they are not developed to convey the science which you have done in English, perfect, do the science in English. But the results of that science, they are meant to help the farmers out there to know how are we going to do with climate change in this way or the other. The languages should be developed, should have the capacity to relay that. But they don't. Why don't they have it? Because the higher education institutions have neglected investing in these local languages, not as a displacement of English as a medium of instruction, but just as a language which can help our own people.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof Manthalu, for your presentation. On the slide that you have up here, you emphasize that decolonization is ultimately a political matter. So I was wondering if, besides Ubuntu, which is more of a moral philosophy, do you think that there are viable African political philosophies that we can draw on to further our thinking on decolonization?
Thank you very much. Actually, the answer, what I would think as the probable answer to the question is just highlights the same problem which you're talking about. Because if you look at how our politics, we do our politics, how should how to conduct our politics in Africa, we largely just get a certain model of democracy from a certain country and we bring it here. I mean, for example, the same thing of a country like Malawi, where you see the levels of just take literacy levels, but sometimes even if everybody, a significant number is literate. Are the people able to process information in a way that they can help them make an informed decision about their country, about the economy, or anything, find that there are limitations. So democracy as an ideal is something which is universal. Every society must have. It's almost a moral imperative. I don't think there is a substitute to democracy in present life. However, democracy ought to come in forms that are responsive to a context. There is a reason why probably British democracy is different from American democracy. Both of them are democracies, but these have got their own form, quite distinct from the American. But whatever happens on the ground, they still abide by principles of democracy. So our challenge has been, it's always trying to get a certain understanding of democracy, yet the way our societies are structured, the values that guide our societies may not necessarily be the same as those of another society. And again, this lack of investment in our own political structures, you can hardly find a political theory that is informed from African perspectives. But all these democracy theories, or theories, political thought, they are not created in a vacuum. If I'm going to think or recommend an ideal political theory, I'll be drawing from what I think my society in an ideal world would be like. So you can't divorce how the assumptions are behind any theory to the lived experience of the one who was coming up with that theory. So our challenge is African philosophy as a philosophy, African political thought haven't been developing. Actually, there was a debate in African philosophy at some point where people were saying there is no philosophy in Africa. And you know, thinkers like Hegel made such bold statements that there is no philosophy, there is no culture in Africa. The thing is, we have not invested as African higher education institutions to get the same democracy, but in a context that is properly fitting to Africa. So we are found without tools at a time like this, but it's something which progressively we can be doing. Maybe that also explains why democracy is struggling to stabilize and be meaningful in most African countries, because the way we have adopted it is not responsive to our context.
Thank you. Chris?
Okay, thank you very much, Prof, for your interesting discussion. And also, I think there's a certain book that I once found that talks about democracy. If the guy is saying, is it democracy or is democracy? Because in an African way, you just borrowed those concepts and then it's becoming a challenge. But my main question is on, I think, yes, Africa, we are rising up now, trying to stand on our feet and try to defend what we know, what we lived, and all that. So my point is, don't you think that these Britain institutions, they sabotaging African development, disguising funding as a way of developing us? For example, I will give an example, like recently the COVID issue of Madagascar that tried to develop a certain traditional help or something to address the COVID thing. What happened to that issue? Going down the memory lane, Zimbabwe with the ESAP Economic Structural Adjustment Program. What happened to that? Talk again. I think recently, I remember the Minister of Finance, when things were not working, he said, "No, it's not me. This was recommended by the IMF." What is happening to that? We are talking of Suzika's work. He talks about the ICH program in Zambia. It says funded by UNESCO. This is UNESCO, right? Where are we going? We are talking of STEM again, that most of these things are promoted by them and they're funding them. Where are we going? I think even in Malawi, I think there's an issue around agriculture, right? That it might be, if I'm not mistaken, that is talking about these institutions also supporting agriculture, sort of. But don't we think they blind us by either their funding or, I don't know, either by their philosophies, for us to feel like whatever they're giving to us is a development thing, yet they're drowning us? Because even the form of education that maybe we have been talking about, we're talking about STEM. Where is it taking us? In as much as it is good in terms of like advancing the technologies and all that, but we are mentioning the issues of affecting our local languages, our international IKS and stuff like that. So my point is, don't we think these institutions are really supporting our progress, disguised through their funding to say we are promoting development in Africa, the dark continent, as they would put it?
All right, thank you. I think the question of intention is quite difficult to pinpoint and say, well, it's the institutions are out on a sabotage mission to undo Africa. What I strongly believe in, though, is that these global financial institutions, they are not global, as it were. Some nations have got dominance in these institutions, and I think that's very evident. Now, it is this connection or this influence with a particular nation that creates problems, which maybe sometimes people think in terms of its sabotage. The reality is that nations have got interest. I actually tell people, even in Malawi, when people complain about World Bank and this and that, I usually say that, if Malawi were to be, let's say overnight, miraculously, Malawi is in the same league as the US. Malawi will also be exploiting other countries, intentionally or unintentionally, because nations, by their nature, they have got interest, just like individuals. So I don't always look at it as if it's the organization is out to get out some other people, but because the nations are in competition, just like human beings compete. I mean, let's face it, all of us doing PhD here, we're competing with other people out there in one way or the other. So it's because of this thing that nations are interested entities, and their interests will compete with another nation. So when this global organization is dominated by the interests of this country, it's inevitable for any institution. This is why I was still emphasizing that no country can face these global institutions because their tentacles are deeply entrenched. It has to be regional cooperation and say that which works together. My last comment though would just be that I think if we look at decolonization that is going to bring progress to Africa, it should be inward looking, because there are a number of challenges in Africa which can be resolved by us Africans, regardless of what these institutions are doing. There are certain things that can bring significant difference in the lives of African people, even if the status quo globally remains the same. So if we cannot address that, but want to address the bigger elephant, I don't think it's possible. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Right on time, 1500, which is the time to end our webinar. Thank you, everyone who joined online, and thank you, everyone in the room. We have Prof Manthalu for dinner tonight. Everyone who's coming for our year-end dinner tonight. We'll have time to engage with Prof. But everyone else online, feel free to reach out to the webinar organizers for Prof Manthalu's email and Dr. Mwela's email for continued engagement. Thank you.